Welcome, welcome, friends and comrades. Welcome back to Anti Imperialist America. I'm your host, Dust James, the Marxist Leninist truck driver, coming to you live from out here in rural North Carolina. It's a nice, cool um, fall evening. We're going to be speaking on a very important issue tonight, the issue of Palestine, as you can see from the flag behind me. And I'm joined by a very good comrade that I've known for a number of years. And it's my honor to have worked with Brother Flame of Liberation. How are you tonight?
Very good, and it's great to be back on with you, Dust.
Right on. So I wanted to start out this show. I know all of us seasoned activists have heard the story that is known around the world, the narrative, the truth of what has happened to the Palestinian people. You know, since the Nakba, the horrible disaster in 48, going on 75 years now. Maybe I know it's hard to hear for people. I know people have already heard it before, but I consider you to be one of my most knowledgeable comrades on this, and I think it's an important story to tell. And the more times we hear it, the better we can tell it, the more people can know about it, and the more the lies of the empire disappear. So maybe just briefly, if you had to can put this history very briefly, how would you put it, comrade?
Right. Well, the history of the Nakba, 1948. This was with the creation of the state of Israel, and this is very important to understand because a lot of the rhetoric around Israel, especially the more, I guess you could say, liberal criticism of Israel, tries to portray it as though the problem of what's going on now in quote unquote Israel occupied Palestine is Netanyahu and the right wing Zionists, and that it's not so much a problem of Israel in and of itself, it's just these right wing extremists of Netanyahu. But the reality is that it's not just Netanyahu, it's from the foundations of the creation of the state of Israel, as we've already started to touch on the Nakba of 1948. That was at the very foundation of the state of Israel. And genocide and ethnic cleansing was inherent to the creation of the state of Israel. And that's why in 1948, the Nakba happened. And I think one very important aspect of it, because in the propaganda, the imperialist propaganda around the creation of the state of Israel, they make it seem as though, the UN partitioned the land and said Arabs could have this area, Jews can have this area, and it was the Arabs who rejected it, and the Arabs just attacked Israel in an act of aggression. But I think a very important fact, before any Arab army, quote unquote, attacked Israel, in reality came to the aid of the Palestinians, before any of that happened, before any of the Arab armies attacked the state of Israel, the Zionists were carrying out massacres against the Palestinians, famously the Deir Yassin massacre. That happened, that was one of the most well-known, but there were loads of these massacres throughout Palestine carried out by these Zionist terrorist organizations, and at the time recognized as terrorist organizations even by the West. These groups like Lehi and Irgun, who even killed British, famously the King David hotel bombing carried out by Zionist terrorists, which killed British and other international individuals there from around the world. But anyway, yeah, the Deir Yassin massacre, that happened before the, as the Zionists and the imperialist narrative likes to portray it as, the Arabs just all attacked Israel before the Arab armies responded and came to the aid of the Palestinians in 1948. The Zionists were carrying out massacres against the Palestinians. And prior to this, the land of Palestine even acknowledged by the British. It wasn't called the British Mandate of Israel. It was called the British Mandate of Palestine because it was Palestine. Everyone knew that it was Palestine. There was no such thing as Israel. And prior to the creation of the State of Israel, Arabs, Jews, and of course there are Arab Jews, Arab Christians, Arab Muslims. All these groups lived together in the land of Palestine. And what caused the the quote unquote conflict of what we see today, in reality, a genocide started in 1948, was the creation of the State of Israel, and it was inherent to Zionism and Israel existing as a state. For them to have the State of Israel, it was inherent that they were going to ethnically cleanse the territory of that the UN called Israel at the time. And let's keep in mind, the Palestinians, other Arabs were never consulted about this, were never asked about it. And this idea of like the two-state solution, the question is, why should Palestinians have to give up any of their land that they've lived in for centuries? You listening to this, imagine the UN came to you and said, oh, your house or your grandparents' house or your parents' house or some house that has been in your family for generations, that's now going to someone else. And you can live over here, but this land you have to get out and you can never come back. You wouldn't accept that. No one would accept that. And Palestinians don't have to accept that. So the concept of the two-state solution is completely illegitimate. And it doesn't matter what foreign power around the world says that this land is quote unquote Israel. You wouldn't accept that. No one would accept that. And so I think summing it up, the Nakba, that was the beginning of the Zionist genocide against the Palestinians. And it was inherent to Zionism to begin with. It wasn't something brought in by Netanyahu or anything later. The genocide and the racism and extremism of Zionism existed from the very beginning.
Wow. I mean that's hard to hear, and it's hard to think about when you supposedly, was it Tuesday? There was 290,000 people, according to CNN and and other NSNBC and the other imperialist news sources, out in mass in favor of Israel.
Yeah, that was BS. It looked like maybe, I don't know, 10,000 or well under 100,000. I mean, come on. Everyone could see the pictures.
I saw somebody say realistically maybe 20,000.
Yeah.
Realistic, maybe like that's good, but like to say it was 300,000. I wonder where they got. No, I think one of the articles had almost 300,000. I wonder where they got the 300,000 number from.
You know.
That they were trying to get at. It was the 300,000 that I personally witnessed in DC, an international crowd, and very diverse and representative of the various prison house of nations and peoples in the United States, came out in support of the Palestinian people as they're being evacuated from even the small land that they've been allocated to and kept in an open air prison camp, are being further condensed and pushed onto smaller amount of land and being forced to do so, physically forced to do so. I mean, it's hard to think about the way it started, the way it's going. I'm just glad more people are waking up to it, because I grew up in a North Carolina rural area, and a lot of the Christian Baptists and evangelists. Billy Graham is from this region. He has his own library in Charlotte, and all the Christian people were like, well, and a lot of these people, they weren't very well off. Maybe some of them bordering, working class, petty bourgeoisie. Some of the more vocal voices. but they weren't super well off. But they go to church and they act like the whole world and the liberal elitist establishments against them. And you got to be Christian, and Christians are an ally of Israel, who is coming, who is going to help bring back Jesus and God on earth. And it's what we were told. And then I got to college in 2009 and 2000 no in 2008, and in 2008 there was another advancement of the genocide and reaction to it. And some of the first demonstrations I went to in college were humanitarian response, as well as the displaced diaspora in Greensboro, North Carolina. That came out, and it's good to see so many people out there. Since I got you on here now, and we started about the dispossession of the land, which is, to me, it's almost like it's like it's almost like a very quick, sudden, primitive accumulation. The crime that was done during primitive accumulation during the capitalist, and first in Europe, and then arguably in the United States with the genocide here, and then the continued dispossession of Chicano people in the Southwest, and further suppression of them. It's almost, we saw in the last 75 years, we've seen like a hyper concentrated, accelerist, brutal form of capital, particularly monopoly capitalism. I think the United States, which leads the imperialist bloc, is using Israel as a beachhead, and this has been done to destabilize the entire region. They use it to carry out attacks. They use it to create chaos and keep the Middle East underdeveloped. So they're dependent on Western financial systems, banks, and can control the energy markets. I mean, that's really what the creation of Israel, the maintaining of Israel, the funding of Israel is all about, when it's all about money. And you think about the people that are mass murdered and then dehumanized, and the way it's portrayed in the media, it's just disgusting. Since I got you on here, maybe you can talk a little bit. I mentioned 2008. Maybe you can talk a little bit of the history between 1948, where there was a massive genocide and forced land theft, and then what's happened since then. Any notable moments?
Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to address, make sure I address, you mentioned with the Christianity and a lot of the supposed Christian churches and organizations in the U.S. They want to pretend, and they don't want people to know that Palestinians, a big section of Palestinians, are Christian. And the Israelis, during this most recent onslaught, actually bombed a very old church in Gaza. So I think that's something that's also very important to emphasize, is that they try and portray it as a religious war between Muslims and Jews, but that's nonsense, because first of all, a lot of Jews are against Zionism, and the founders of Zionism weren't even religious, a lot of them. Like Theodore Herzl, he wasn't religious at all. And when it comes to Palestinians, Palestinians are Muslim and Christian, so it's not a religious war. Just wanted to emphasize that, and how there are a lot of Palestinian Christians. And if you're a Christian in America and you're supporting Zionism, that's absolute insanity, because Zionism is extremely hostile to Christians as well. All you need to do is look at how Christians, Palestinian Christians, but even foreign Christians who go to Palestine, looking at it as the Holy Land, going there on trips, are spit on by Zionist Israeli settlers. And the Israelis often, these extremist Zionists will often go into churches and attack the churches and destroy things. And so it's very, very clear that Zionism is very hostile towards Christianity as well. And for anyone claiming to be a Christian who supports Zionism is completely delusional. But yeah, as far as the history from 1948 till now, I think some key points in there are, well, I think it's important to emphasize the other Arab states that tried to help Palestine. as I mentioned in 1948, uh, as it's often talked about from the Zionists, they say like, oh, all these Arab armies attacked Israel. These governments were pretty much entirely in 1948 Western puppets, monarchies installed by the West. And even for them, the creation of the state of Israel was a little bit too far for them. But of course, being that they were Western puppet monarchies, very corrupt, they didn't fight very effectively. There were Arab volunteers who fought in the Arab Liberation Army, who fought very bravely. But as far as like the states, there wasn't really. It was not really like what came later with the leadership of Nasser or the various Ba'athist states. And so, mentioning Nasser, and bringing it back to how you mentioned how Israel was an attack dog for the West, the U.S. and the West. Um, the Arab governments that came about, many of them, such as in Egypt with Nasser, probably the most prominent one, at least in the earlier stages of the Zionist occupation, uh, many of these governments aligned with the Soviet Union and went on a socialist path of development. And a good example of that was Nasser. And the U.S. did not like Nasser. The U.S. wanted regime change against Nasser. And Israel was an effective entity for the U.S. To fight against Nasser and Nasserism and the ideas of pan-Arabism. Also later with Iraq, during the Iran-Iraq War, Israel attacked Iraq basically on behalf of the U.S., bombed an Iraqi nuclear facility in Osirek. And by Israel doing that, carrying it out, the U.S. could pretend, oh, we had nothing to do with it. It was the Israelis that did it. So I think those are very important points to emphasize, and how the Soviet Union was a key backer of the Arab states against Israel. Pretty much all the weaponry used by Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, and provided to the Palestinian guerrilla organizations, or Fedayeen at the time, were most of those weapons came from the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc countries, as well as some from China before Deng Xiaoping. Um, so that's very important. And in the context of the Cold War, the U.S. was very keen on backing Israel because they understood that Israel was their attack dog in the Middle East, along with Iran during the Shah. And then after the Shah with Khomeini, it got a little bit more complicated, but Israel supported Khomeini. But Israel was the most reliable and important attack dog for U.S. imperialism in the Middle East. And when it would carry out massacres and steal more land, because over the years they did steal more land, um, such as the Golan Heights. They stole the Golan Heights from Syria. Until this day, they still occupy the Golan Heights. And up until Donald Trump, even the U.S. did not recognize that as Israeli, quote unquote, Israeli territory. It was only when Trump came in that the U.S. officially recognized the Golan as part of Israel. And of course, Biden didn't reverse that. He continued that policy from Trump. And so I think some other key points within the history, I'm kind of jumping around, but let's look at the 1960s, for example. Besides the Arab states that were fighting against Israel, the Palestinians themselves organized Fedayeen, and this was eventually the PLO came about. And the PLO is an umbrella organization which included both Fatah, who later, and Yasser Arafat, who basically, you could say, sold out to Israel by recognizing the state of Israel. But there are other groups within the PLO. Again, it's an umbrella organization of different organizations. The PFLP, which is a Marxist-Leninist group, the Arab Liberation Front, which is a Ba'athist group backed by Iraq, and lots of other groups were made up the PLO, and they had a stronghold in Jordan, and they were operating out of Jordan in guerrilla attacks against the Zionist occupation from Jordan. But then what happened, I believe it was 1970, Black September, where the Jordanian government, which of course is a U.S.-backed monarchy, attacked the Palestinians and drove them out of Jordan, and that was known as Black September. And from there, the Palestinian resistance, which made up a lot of groups, as I mentioned, within the PLO, such as the PFLP, Fatah, and other groups, they began operating out of Lebanon. And then from there, Israel attacked Lebanon in alliance with right-wing Lebanese forces. And the Palestinians were also in alliance with Lebanese forces, much more, representing much more of the Lebanese people, actually. And this was the Lebanese Civil War. And the right-wing forces that aligned with Israel were much more from the ruling class of Lebanon, much wealthier people, particularly Maronite Christians. Although it should be made clear that a lot of Christians did support the Palestinians, and Sunni Muslims and Shiite Muslims, for the most part, were against Zionism. And the Lebanese left, communists and social democrats, also fought alongside with the Palestinians against the Israelis and the Lebanese right wing. Then eventually, with the conclusion of the Lebanese civil war, the Israelis were driven out, but the PLO also, there was a deal where the PLO also had to stop operating in southern Lebanon. And then from there, we're getting into the late 80s, early 90s. And so it's kind of tricky to, I have to jump around because various parts of this go forward and pass other areas. So I mentioned before Egypt with Nasser. In the 70s, you got a new leader after Nasser died, Anwar Sadat, who did fight against Israel initially in the October War in 1973. And interestingly, just before October 7th, the Palestinian resistance operation on October 7th this year is the date October 6th. And October 6th, 1973 was October 6th of this year was the 50th year anniversary of the October War. And on that day, Egypt really kicked Israel's ass. The Israelis had, and they were occupying the Sinai, which is Egyptian territory. The Israelis had what was known as the most impregnable defense line called the Bar-Lev line that the West was saying was impregnable, and it was this massive defense line, and the Egyptians were able to overrun it in record time and drive the Israelis back in a humiliating defeat. At the time, the worst defeat the Israelis had faced. I think what they got 50 years and one day later was a much bigger defeat, what happened this year. But at that time, that was the biggest defeat that the Israelis had. And the Israelis were forced to return the Sinai to Egypt, but unfortunately, Anwar Sadat sold out and made "quote unquote" peace. In other words, stabbed the Palestinians in the back, and he also switched Egypt's along with selling out to Israel after that war, despite being victorious against the Israelis. He also switched. Prior, Egypt was allied with the Soviet Union. He basically made Egypt a U.S. puppet state, and of course, by doing so, aligned with Israel as well, and recognizing Israel. So, after the October War, Egypt was no longer a backer of the Palestinian resistance, and the remaining anti-Zionist states, Libya, Iraq, and Syria in particular, blacklisted Egypt. And at that point, Iraq became the key backer of the Palestinians. Egypt and Syria, sorry, not Egypt, Libya and Syria also supported various factions, but more so factions that they controlled and were not so much interested in Palestinian liberation, but more so their states' direct, more immediate interests. Iraq was really the key backer of the Palestinians after Nasser, and Saddam was really the key backer of the Palestinians, and supported heavily the rejectionist front, which called for no negotiations or recognition of the state of Israel. And that's really, besides Iraq being such a strong socialist state in and of itself and allied with the Soviet Union, the fact that Iraq was such a staunch backer of the Palestinians, and in particular, the Palestinians who would not recognize the state of Israel, the U.S. and Israel really began to target Iraq. And with the Iran-Iraq war, there's a lot of misconceptions around that. I'm not going to get too much into that because I've talked about that a lot, but Israel fully backed Iran against Iraq, and that with the U.S. it was a bit more complicated. It was more covert backing to Iran. But with the end of the Iran-Iraq war and Iraq's victory over Iran, the U.S. and Israel were very alarmed by that, because now you have this Arab socialist, anti-imperialist, staunchly anti-Zionist state that is now had this major victory and is strengthened and bolstered by that victory. And so shortly after that, the U.S. launched the Gulf War in Kuwait against Iraq. And there were a lot of Palestinians in Kuwait, actually, and they supported Iraq. And after the U.S. came in, and the U.S. and like over a dozen other countries they had to bring in to fight against the Iraqis, all of those international force they had to bring in, they eventually drove the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. And the Kuwaiti regime expelled all the Palestinians because they supported Iraq. And from there, you also had the collapse of the overthrow of the Soviet Union. So with the targeting of Iraq and the overthrow of the Soviet Union, you really started to see that was really a major setback for the Palestinian liberation struggle, because these two strong backers of the Palestinian resistance, or the Soviet Union, is now gone. And Iraq is now very much weakened because of all the sanctions and targeting of Iraq. But still, up until 2003, despite that, Iraq was giving tremendous support to the Palestinians. And of course, after 2003, the invasion and overthrow of Iraq, which Netanyahu was a major advocate for, that was a major support for the Palestinians that was taken out with the overthrow in 2003. So then, since then, you mentioned 2008, and this wasn't the first attack on Gaza. I guess as we're getting more to the more recent history, I'll sum up real quick. Prior to 2005, the Israelis occupied Gaza, and the Zionist propaganda and imperialist propaganda tries to portray it as, oh, look, we gave Gaza to the Palestinians. I've even seen some of these idiots say, oh, we already freed Gaza. We got out and gave it to them. Well, that's complete nonsense, because the only reason the Israelis got out of Gaza is because the resistance was so strong. They could not control Gaza. They were driven out by the Palestinian resistance. And Hamas, I believe in 2006, after the Israelis were driven out, were democratically elected by the Palestinian people in Gaza. And again, democratically elected. The West likes to talk about democracy and all of that. Well, here's a case where the Palestinians voted for Hamas, and the U.S. doesn't like that. They are democratically elected, whether the U.S. likes it or not. So after 2005, 2006, Hamas was the ruling government in Gaza. And since then, Israel has repeatedly bombed Gaza. As you mentioned, 2008, 2009, they bombed Gaza. That was a big one. 2014 also, I think when 2014 happened, that was the biggest at the time. Then 2021, they bombed Gaza again, and I think that outdid 2014. And this time around, 2023, I think, has outdone all of the previous Zionist bombings of Gaza. And of course, during this whole period, the U.S. has given all these various onslaughts that Israel has carried out against Gaza. And then there were also numerous within that period as well, which I haven't mentioned, 2012 also. And in and out, Israel will regularly bomb Gaza here or there. And of course, the area is under siege. They cannot get in basic resources and medicine and food and fuel that they need. The situations, even before the bombardment of Gaza this year, the situation was horrendous. I think half of the population's unemployed, not even like 4 hours of electricity a day. Just a horrible situation. The water situation, terrible. It's on the coast, and they're blockaded from going out into the water, like at a certain distance. And the Israelis shoot at Palestinian fishermen. So even before this current onslaught, the situation in Gaza was a siege, and it was a horrendous situation. But I think that sort of takes us where we are up to today, what's going on now in Gaza.
Thank you, brother. Thank you so much for that very enlightening history. I actually didn't get the connection between the Gulf War, Israel, and the progression of U.S. imperialism after the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's you kind of made all those global connections for me in a very concise way. Thank you, brother. Maybe I can respond quickly to the comment on Christianity. When I was saying earlier, I'm like, we're constantly told, or I'm in the South, and this is what we're told, that that somehow Jesus is going to come back, and we need Israel for the rapture. This is told. This is what's told to people, and honestly, from my perspective, this is completely separate. If you read the words in red in the New Testament, if you read Sermon on the Mount, you read what Gandhi talked about or what Martin Luther King talked about, and some of these other Christian pacifist revolutionary figures, and some of them not so pacifist. You look at the light of God is in everyone. The meek shall inherit the earth. And Jesus actually was a pacifist. He says, turn the other cheek to an extent. There's an argument for that. But the idea that light of God is in everyone, and how I think it was, you should treat like you're supposed to love God and appreciate God. And God says, I think there's a famous verse that says, how you treat the least amongst you is how you treat me. I mean, you think about that. How is mass murdering and genocide entire people on behalf of capitalists and rich bankers to have control over the global economy Christian whatsoever? That's that's insanity. That does not compute. It doesn't go together. I mean, you can look at Christian socialists like the Nicaraguans, who have respected the indigenous people, have some of the best policies regarding the indigenous people as far as autonomy, federally funded autonomous schools teaching indigenous languages, microloans, infrastructure. If you look at a wonderful project in Nicaraguan socialism, under guidance from socialist Christianity or Christian socialism, in a way, is a beautiful thing. And I don't think they're very keen on Israel.
Not at all. Yeah.
The government that wants to crush them, the main backer of the government that wants to crush them. I actually want to do a small blurt. I'm planning on doing maybe a panel discussion about fascism coming up. And I just got to say, fascism in particular is a tool that the capitalists use in crisis to mobilize the masses towards destruction. That's what it is. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions. A lot of people put fascism, it's on the inherent, like American fascism is because they killed the indigenous peoples and it's some original sin of the American people. And that's why America is prone to fascism. And I think there's definitely something to say about that horrible history and the contradictions of a so-called Enlightenment era country founded for liberty and justice of all, having slaves and such. And we've heard that. When it comes down to it, fascism is a very specific project with a very specific goal and a very specific time period. And a lot of times It's astroturfed. It's funded and it's created for who? It's monopoly capitalists and their profits. And we see this with Christian fascism, religious fascism in the South, Trumpism. All these things aren't inherent in the American people. Actually, rural people in general like Trump less and less now. And if we looked at this Trumpism was pushed on rural workers. Zionism is being pushed on the Christian churches. A lot of there's this one horrible chain church. I'll say the name of it, Crossroads, whose material is literally written by the State Department,
Huh.
who plays these astroturfed country songs at their churches and has generals come up and speak in their church. It's disgusting. But I am going to do people look out for that. I'm going to do a panel discussion from people from around the South, as well as in other parts of the world, where fascism has been pushed upon the people in not so covert ways, very specific funding, targeting, and effective propaganda against the people. Maybe a response on that, brother.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. This sort of stuff, whether it be the Zionism, uh, this sort of Christian, quote unquote Christian Zionism, or the Trump movement, who the two are kind of one and the same in a way, because Trump was, up until him, he was the most Zionist president more than any of his predecessors. Now I think Biden's starting to give him a run for his money. But it's, I mean, oh, you mean to tell me that this billionaire from New York City is not as popular with people in the country as they try and make it seem? Oh, I'm astounded. Yeah, of course. And it is, I mean, it's completely astroturfed. And I mean, for them to try and convince Christians in America that Israel is their friend when Israel is killing Christians, has been killing Christians since 1948, and is attacking Christians till this day, bombing churches. I mean, it's pretty obvious to get Christians to support that. It's got to be pretty astroturfed to get Christians to support the massacre of Christians. It's absolutely insane.
So I did a live recently with my comrade Musa out of Philly, who is a writer for the Burning Spear of the Uhuru movement. And we attended 2 rallies in DC, and I got to witness the 300,000 people strong, largest Palestinian rally in the United States in history. And I've been watching your channel, Comrade Flame of Liberation, and you've had various lives from the movement on the ground there in New York City. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that movement and what has happened and some of your analysis on it.
Yeah, and that was great. You were there in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it, but I was able to cover, and I have a live stream from that day in New York City. There was a large rally in New York City, larger than I expected, considering so many people from New York had gone to D.C. There was still a large crowd in New York City protesting for Palestine. But yeah, I think, I've been involved in Palestine organizing for about a decade, like in actual, like in real life organizing. And whenever there is an onslaught against Gaza, people come out in big numbers. But this is on another level. I remember 2012, in November, I believe, of 2012, when Israel did an onslaught against Gaza. There were sizable protests. Then in 2014, there were even bigger protests from what I hear from organizers, Palestinian organizers who've been doing this like back in the 90s and early 2000s, that in 2014, that was like a revitalization, you could say, of the Palestine movement in the U.S., because there was such an outpouring then. Then from, I think, the next major onslaught, I mean, of course, within all of these, there's the day in, day out sort of stuff that Israel's doing, and it's an ongoing genocide, even when Israel's not bombarding Gaza. But I think the next really major onslaught was in 2021. Although, again, they did bomb Gaza within there. I don't want to make it seem as though this is the only time. Um, but within there, I was involved in organizing protests against various companies that are working with Israel and facilitate Israel's occupation and imprisonment of Palestinians, including massive numbers of Palestinian children. Um, and including even organizing weekly protests, like every single week on particular on Fridays for a couple years. And those protests were pretty small, maybe a dozen, 2 dozen people, but people would come out, and I mean, it was good. The unfortunate thing is that you didn't see major crowds when it was sort of just the day in, day out uh, genocidal activities that Israel is carrying out. But in 2021, you saw big crowds come out again. And within there were also big crowds. I don't want to make it seem as though from 2014 to 2021, there weren't big crowds. There were. Like in 2017, for example, when Trump, quote unquote, recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel illegally, which he has no authority to do. There were big crowds and various other things that were going on over the years. Big crowds would show up. But 2021 is when you got like really big crowds and multiple demonstrations day after day, or a lot going on around then. But now, with what's going on in 2023, this is something new because, at least in New York City, what I'm seeing is every day there's actions. Now, when I say actions, I don't necessarily mean the massive protests, but there are things going on in all different boroughs in Manhattan, which, of course, is the center where most of the stuff goes on, but a lot of stuff in Brooklyn, some things in the Bronx, some things in Queens, some things in Staten Island. Every day there is some action or another, often multiple actions going on. And then usually what happens is like 1 or 2 days out of the week, there'll be like a really large one. And what it's starting to shape out to be now is that it looks like Fridays is where there's large actions going on in New York City. So I would urge people to tune in this Friday. I'm going to live stream the big Palestine protest. Last week there were arrests that happened and some good action, some good activities. We marched past the New York Times building in New York City, and of course I think the New York Times is known throughout the country and throughout the world, and it's described by the establishment as the paper of record, and it's it's viewed as like a very reliable source, but it's not. It's really propaganda, imperialist propaganda. They've never seen a war that they don't like. They lied about the Iraq War. They lied about Syria, Libya. Going back further, they lied about Korea, and they would denounce the few anti-war in Korea demonstrations that were going on. So they've always been imperialist propaganda, and now they're continuing to spread propaganda to justify the occupation and genocide by Israel against the Palestinians. And so when we marched past the New York Times headquarters, people actually threw fake blood on the doors to represent how they had blood on their hands, and that was, I think, a very symbolic, very good action. And then we marched past the Grand Central Station, which is one of the busiest places in Manhattan, the busiest station, as you could tell by the name Grand Central. And when we got there, the police actually blocked all the entrances and exits. That's something I had never seen before. I don't even know how people got out from there. I guess maybe they let out trickles from the sides where there wasn't a crowd, but they blocked all the entrances because I went around to other entrances to check, and they were all closed. And I think the reason they did that is because some weeks earlier there was a massive sit-in in Grand Central Station where they mass arrested a lot of people, and the whole Grand Central, there's like one major room and one major hall, basically, a huge hall, which is like sort of the center of Grand Central, and it was full of protesters, and they did a sit-in there, and the police came and arrested. I don't know if it was all of them or most of them, but they mass arrested a lot of people, and I think they wanted to prevent that because that raised a lot of awareness. So I think in summary of what's been going on, from what I've seen firsthand in New York City, and from what I've been seeing online from other parts of the country, and from what I've seen at the demonstration you were at in D.C., I think this is on another level, the amount of protests going on, and internationally as well, in London as well. The UK, of course, being another key backer of Israel. Um, this is an unprecedented upsurge of support for Palestine. Lots of people coming out who had never been to protests before. Um, Lots of people who haven't come out to these protests in the past now coming out to voice their opposition to Israel's genocide against the Palestinians. So I think we're really starting to see an acceleration of public opinion turning against the Zionist state, because it's becoming so clear they really can't justify these bombing hospitals repeatedly, just the levels of children that they've massacred, not to mention everyone else that they've massacred, of course, all of which are war crimes. But I think particularly look at the amount of children they've massacred, it's hard for people to look away from that.
Then thank you so much for doing those lives and putting that journalistic work, insurgent journalistic anti-imperialist work. And everybody who hasn't subscribed, please subscribe to Flame of Liberation. You can find both his Twitter link and his YouTube link in the comments of this video. Please subscribe to his YouTube and hit the notification bell. Do that here if you haven't as well, and you should get a notification. Was it, you said Thursday or Friday? No, Friday.
Friday. Yeah,
Friday.
This Friday. Yeah, Friday. Everyone
tomorrow.
Tune in.
Okay.
Oh, the day
no,
after tomorrow.
Today's Wednesday. Tomorrow's Thursday. So this Friday, get that notification and watch live History in the Making on the ground in New York City.
That's right. There's a lot of action that goes on, and leave a comment, ask a question. Make sure to tune in on Friday, because I'm going to be there filming it all.
So we went over some of the history. Maybe I could just respond to some of the more current developments that you stated. There's been protests all over the country, including the South and Texas. There was one here in Durham, North Carolina. There was one recently in San Francisco. And there's been protests across the Midwest. We're seeing even more and more solidarity with Palestinian people in rural areas that hasn't been seen before across the country. And I think it's a beautiful thing. Thinking about growing up in a military town, and when I did counter recruitment in high school, and I did a protest at recruitment center. I think I got 3 people to show up, and the recruiters came out and tried to recruit me to the Marines, and they laughed at us. So I'm used to being the minority as an anti-imperialist in the South, and I'm used to being laughed at. I'm used to being jeered, and now I'm looking at these liars and pundits that my neighbors and coworkers have just quoted verbatimly for decades. And I'm seeing people reject them and come out and say something different and learn and be open to different opinions. And I'm saying these liars, liberal and conservative alike, be like, Israel's losing as much support. Look at the masses of the people in the street. Public opinion is turned against our holy cow, Israel, or what? It's beautiful, man. I got no words. I'm inspired. This is a great feeling. This is a great moment to finally see more people see the truth and see the liars.
And especially young people, right? Very young people. You're seeing very young. I remember so earlier on when I was getting involved with Palestine organizing, a lot of times I was one of the youngest people or on the younger end of people. Now there's people showing up to these protests that I'm talking with who are, I find out they're younger than me. So there's a lot of and you look at the crowds, it's generally very young, and there's older people too who support, but overall the crowd is overwhelmingly young people. And I think that's something they're scared of, is because the next generations are much more supportive of Palestine.
Hmm. Well, let's get into. We got a little bit of time left. Maybe we can get into some of these ideological debate amongst supporters of Palestine. Starting on maybe some of the more liberal end, and then going up to some of the deviations within comrades. First of all, do you condemn Hamas? You absolutely have to, or you're a terrorist. Just, just put it
Right.
out there. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and also I just want to say I can't stay for that much longer, but we could do this segment real quick. Yeah. If someone asks me that, I'm going to ask them, do you condemn Netanyahu? Do you condemn Israel's massacre of thousands of children? I find it hilarious how these same people who will condemn the operation that happened on October 7th, the Al Aqsa flood, as it's called, as, oh, it was a horrendous Hamas attack. Why was it it was a horrendous Hamas terrorist attack. Oh, why was it a terrorist attack? Oh, well, some civilians were killed. Oh, okay, so some civilians were killed as a terrorist attack. Okay, so you condemn that. Okay. So Israel's bombing Gaza right now. A lot of civilians are being killed. Are you going to condemn that as a terrorist attack? Why not? It becomes very obvious that these people are full of shit. And
What was that
they
dude, that Letterman guy, that new sheepdog who dresses real slobby? He's all like, "Oh, you got to let Israel do what it needs to do."
Who's
Oh,
that? I don't know.
the Letterman guy. You know what I'm talking about? The
I know
bald
Pierce
guy, the
Morgan.
big guy. Well, I don't remember his
Oh,
name, man.
oh,
You know
Fetterman. You
the
mean Fetterman,
Yeah,
the elected
Fetterman,
official?
Fetterman,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah,
He
yeah,
straight up said, "Let Israel do what it got to do."
yeah.
And then you see sign. I saw a sign of this rally of
Oh,
twenty
yeah,
thousand
yeah.
people that said, "Let Israel do
Israel
what it
fin.
needs to."
Yeah, it said like
Basically,
let
no
Israel finish the
ceasefire.
job. It's something like that.
Yeah,
Let
let them
Israel
finish the job.
finish
What
the
does that
job.
mean?
Basically,
Genocide.
and these
Like
Zionists at
let them do
demonstrations,
genocide because
they've said at demonstrations, you could find the interviews with Zionists holding up the Israeli flag saying, quote, kill all Palestinians, kill all Arabs. This is what they mean. It is full intent to commit genocide. And you have statements from the Israeli government calling Palestinians in Gaza animals and all kinds of dehumanizing language. So it's very clear what they're trying to do. But the Fetterman thing, that was interesting because I think the initial thing with Fetterman, pushback against him, was with Dan Kovalik, who's a great independent journalist. He confronted Fetterman and very kind, very respectful. He went up to Fetterman, showing Fetterman much more respect than he deserves, even saying, why can't you call for a ceasefire? He even told Fetterman, I think you're a nice guy, but you really should support the ceasefire. I voted for you. This is him speaking. Apparently, he voted for him. Um, and you should be calling for a ceasefire. Very respectful, very kind. And Fetterman basically sicks one of his security people and has him thrown out of an event that he paid a ticket to get into. So that tells you what kind of person And then Fetterman's just gone even more blatant from there. I think there were some protesters getting arrested nearby him, and he was in the background waving an Israeli flag. Just a despicable person. All these people all these elected politicians and media propagandists who were talking about the horrendous Russian invasion of Ukraine, now are whitewashing what Israel's doing, which is way, way, way beyond what Russia did. I mean, they talked about, oh, Russia's killing civilians. Well, what Israel is doing is way beyond anything that Russia has done. Not to mention the whole history of what Zionism has done, and the fact that the people in Gaza were already refugees from other parts of Palestine and under siege in an open air concentration camp to begin with. So I think this has really exposed the Democrats. People already knew that the Republicans were ultra Zionists and everything, and people should have known that the Democrats are just as Zionist. But I think I'm seeing online a lot of people who previously voted for Democrats saying that they will now never vote for Joe Biden. They're obviously not going to vote for Trump either. But a lot of Democrats, even Democratic voters, are starting to say this is too far. And I think especially progressive voters in general, and I think Democrats a lot overall, but especially the Muslim community and Arab community, Joe Biden is basically basically said, "We don't need you," to those communities, and this is going to hurt him big time, I think.
Yeah, I mean that's the whole imperialist duopolies. Its whole thing. I mean genocide. One guy who bans people, Trump's travel ban, simply based on their religion. The other one who's continues to fund the genocide.
Yep.
It's
And
like
Trump recognized Jerusalem and the
mhm.
Golan Heights as Israeli, an unprecedented move. No other president did. So it's not to say that Trump is any better, obviously, because some idiots are going to try and say, "Oh, vote for
Mm,
Trump." Then no, Trump is just as bad.
mm. Well, I know you don't got a lot of time left. Maybe we could just finish this one point. I think the primary ideological division amongst socialist Marxists is those who support national liberation and those who support a form of international socialism. I'm in favor of international. I'm in favor of internationalism, but it takes national liberation and equality of nations to have true internationalism. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah,
Like I watch some people say, well, Hamas is a pawn of Israel, and both Israel and Hamas are against the workers of Israel and Palestine. And if only the workers of Israel and Palestine can come together, then they could rid both the enemy of the Palestinian bourgeois and the Israeli bourgeois. How would you
yeah.
respond?
Yeah, that's such an absurd talking point, and I think the best way to respond to that is that, well, there's two stupid lines that I'm hearing that, oh, Hamas is an Iranian proxy, which is complete nonsense. Iran and Hamas were completely at odds when it came to Syria, um, and this operation that they carried out was completely independent. Iran has said that they had no knowledge of it and that they're not going to come to the aid of the Palestinians. So that's one. Then this other line that, oh, Hamas is a puppet of Israel. That's such nonsense because regardless of whatever alleged historical activity may have happened, after Fatah, which isn't the whole of the PLO, it's one of the factions of the umbrella organization, Fatah, and what became the Palestinian Authority, sold out and recognized the state of Israel. Hamas gained popularity because of the fact that it did not recognize the state of Israel and was willing to fight against Israel, and that's what they've been doing. And these supposed leftists who talk about the Israeli working class and how Hamas represents the Palestinian bourgeoisie, they're so out of touch because for so many reasons, but I think one very key thing to point out that puts that line to rest is that the Palestinian communists, the Palestinian leftists of the PFLP and DFLP are fighting shoulder to shoulder with Hamas against Israel right now. So this idea that Hamas is an Israeli puppet is just completely absurd. They've been fighting against Israel. They've been the group that's been fighting Israel the most consistently since the days of the Fedayeen when the PLO was united in its fighting against Israel. Hamas has been really the vanguard of the Palestinian factions, and the other Palestinian factions that have not sold out, such as the PFLP and the other Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Arab Liberation Front, and other Palestinian factions, they are allied with Hamas. And the Palestinian resistance, Hamas is the leading, they are the government of Gaza, but they're in alliance with all these other factions which represent communists, secular nationalists, other Islamists. So it's a diverse group of fighters, and these supposed socialists or communists, ultra leftists in the West who condemn Hamas and say that it represents the bourgeoisie, they're so out of touch because actual Palestinian communists who are engaging in struggle and for liberation of their homeland are allied with Hamas. So, I mean, what else is there to say about it? The Yeah, these are, I guess you could actually call these people, the term class reductionist gets thrown around a lot, but I think these people could maybe legitimately be called class reductionists, especially when they talk about the Israeli working class. I mean, it's complete nonsense. I don't know what Israeli working class exists when they import, not only do they exploit Palestinian labor, but they also bring in like Filipinos and South Asians to work as housekeepers for them. So this talk of the so-called Israeli working class is it's ridiculous. I don't want to discount, the possibility of Israelis rejecting Zionism, but to do so, they really have to. It's not just about criticizing Netanyahu; it's about getting out of there, not supporting the occupation any longer, and the key being defending the right of the Palestinians to defend themselves. If Israelis want to do that, they want to point out that Palestinians have the right to defend themselves, and they want to separate themselves from the Zionist occupation. They don't want to serve in the IDF. They want to get out of occupied Palestine. That's good. That's good work. And they would stop identifying as an Israeli at that point because it's a made-up identity. But if Jews in so-called Israel want to support Palestine, they definitely could, and a lot do. Not nearly enough, but a significant amount do. So, no, Palestinians have the right to defend themselves. Palestinians have the right to national liberation. And really, regardless of, obviously, be best if it was led by communist socialists, but really anyone, regardless of their ideology, whoever is leading the fight for their national liberation deserves credit for that and has the right to do so.
Very powerful. I like that. I like that idea. What if there was like a John Brown uh, version of an Israeli citizen, running guns for the Palestinian
Yeah,
resistance,
not
undermining,
just
running
not just
raids to
criticizing,
stop.
not just
What if we had an Israeli running a raid on an armory to get the
and
weapons?
not just criticizing Netanyahu, but against the entire occupation. But I got to run pretty soon. If there's any
All right, let's just
last,
go
real
into
quick.
a brief end of conclusions, just
Yep.
very quick conclusions. I think you hit the nail on the head. In the current era of monopoly capitalism, Lenin defined and Stalin basically put in very coherent language the three contradictions, two of which are, the worker and the capitalist, and also the oppressor nation and the oppressed nation. And it is a class struggle when oppressed nations overthrow imperialist oppression and get their full dignity and and can control their own resources, speak their own language, associate who they want to associate with. I mean, that's a tremendous contradiction that the international proletariat supports and understands, identifies with, and stands in solidarity with. And that's what we just got to keep doing. Any last statements, brother? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you for having me on. I think this has been a great discussion. We should do another one sometime soon to talk about some of these points further and give updates on organizing going on. But yeah, I want to thank you for having me on, and I should have you back on my channel again sometime soon as well. And I want to encourage people to tune in this Friday to the coverage I'm going to give of the protests in Palestine.
All right. You know the deal. Raise your fist. Repeat after me. All power to the people.
All power to the people.
Right on. Thank you, comrades. Good night.
Have a good night.